You're a talented girl, Josephine. But talent without patience is just noise that hasn't learned to behave yet. That's what my professor said to me 3 weeks before he stood on a stage and read my own sentences aloud as his. Nod that my name is Josephine Marlowe. Everyone calls me Jo. I was 26 years old in my final year of an MFA program, and this is the story of how I destroyed the most celebrated literary reputation in the country without ever raising my voice above a whisper. I spent 3 years writing a novel called The Glass Orchard. I want to tell you, honestly, it was the best thing I'd ever made. The kind of book you don't fully understand. You're capable of writing until you're finished and staring at it, wondering where it actually came from. It began as a short story about my grandmother's actual orchard, the one she'd tended for 40 years before a slow, mysterious blight killed it from the roots outward, no one ever quite identifying the cause. Somewhere in the second year of expanding that story into a full novel, it became something else entirely. A meditation on inheritance, on the specific poison that can live quietly inside a family or an institution for generations before anyone names it. I wrote most of it during the 11 to 2 shift at a 24-hour diner, the only stretch of my week with enough uninterrupted quiet to actually think in complete sentences. My thesis advisor was Professor Malcolm Thorne, a novelist who'd published 2 genuinely brilliant books in his 30s, won nearly every prize the literary world hands out, and then gone quiet for 12 years. Some writers call that quiet a fallow period. Others, more honestly, call it what it usually is, the well running dry, and the person standing over it unwilling to admit it in public. I remember finishing the final draft of The Glass Orchard at 4 in the morning, printing it at the 24-hour copy shop near campus because my own printer had run out of ink 2 chapters from the end, and sitting in my car afterward just holding the finished manuscript in my lap for almost 10 minutes before I could bring myself to drive home. I'd never made anything I was that certain of before. I wanted desperately for someone whose judgment the world already trusted to confirm what I already believed about it. I gave him my full manuscript in October, hoping for feedback, maybe an introduction to his agent if he thought it was ready. He kept it for 6 weeks. When he finally called me into his office, he told me it wasn't ready. He said the structure needed considerable reworking, that the voice was promising but undisciplined, and that I should focus on shorter pieces for now and revisit the novel once I'd matured as a writer. I remember that office vividly. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, his own 2 novels prominently displayed at eye level. A chair positioned slightly lower than his own so that everyone who sat across from him did so looking faintly upward. He flipped through my manuscript slowly during that meeting, pausing on specific pages, occasionally reading a line back to me aloud in a tone I mistook, at the time, for genuine appreciation rather than what I now understand it actually was. A man committing sentences to memory. You're a talented girl, Josephine, he said, sliding the manuscript back across his desk. But talent without patience is just noise that hasn't learned to behave yet. I believed him. That's the part that still embarrasses me looking back. I trusted him completely, the way you trust anyone whose opinion has been declared correct by enough prize committees. I spent the following months writing shorter pieces exactly as instructed, setting The Glass Orchard aside in a drawer, genuinely convinced I simply wasn't ready yet. 11 months later, Malcolm Thorne published a novel called The Orchard of Ash, his first new book in 12 years. The literary world treated it like a resurrection. I found out about it the way most people did, from a glowing profile in a major newspaper describing his long-awaited return, praising the novel's startling, mature new voice, unlike anything in his earlier catalog. I remember reading that specific phrase, unlike anything in his earlier catalog, and feeling something cold move through me before I'd even seen a single page of the actual book. I read the first chapter in a bookstore, standing in the aisle, my own name nowhere near it. The plot was rearranged. Character names were changed. But the sentences, the actual sentences, the rhythm of them, the specific unusual metaphor I'd built an entire chapter around involving a orchard poisoned slowly from its own roots, those were mine, word for word in places, reorganized just enough everywhere else to make a plagiarism claim difficult to prove cleanly. I stood in that aisle for almost 20 minutes reading my own novel wearing someone else's name, someone else's 12-year comeback narrative built entirely out of the thing I'd handed him in good faith, believing he was helping me become a better writer. I called my closest friend from the program, a poet named Beatrice, from the parking lot outside that bookstore, still holding the receipt for a book I'd bought purely so I could keep reading it without a store employee asking why I was crying near the literary fiction shelf. Beatrice listened to the whole thing without interrupting once and then said quietly, "Joe, you need to decide right now whether you're going to let this destroy you or teach you something. I don't think there's a comfortable third option available." I didn't have an answer for her that night. It took the bellwether ceremony itself, a few weeks later, to finally give me one. The Bellwether Prize is the single largest literary award given out each year. 6 figures in prize money, the kind of recognition that turns a career into a legacy. The Orchard of Ash won it that spring. I went to the ceremony. I don't fully know why, even now, except that some part of me needed to see it happen in person, needed to stop pretending there was some other explanation waiting to reveal itself. I told myself on the drive there that maybe I'd misremembered my own sentences, that maybe 3 years of obsessive rewriting had made me paranoid about phrases that were, in truth, more common than I realized. I wanted, badly, to be wrong. Malcolm Thorne stood at that podium in a room full of the most respected people in American literature and read the passage. My passage, "The Orchard Poisoned from Its Own Roots." He read it beautifully, with exactly the cadence I'd built into it during 11 drafts, and the room gave him a standing ovation for a sentence I had written alone at 2 in the morning, 18 months earlier. I sat in the fourth row, clapping along mechanically, because standing still while everyone around me celebrated would have drawn exactly the kind of attention I wasn't ready for yet. I remember the specific physical sensation of that applause washing over me, my own hands moving without any input from the rest of me, my mind somewhere entirely separate, calculating. I want to tell you about the specific decision I made in that room, because it's the hinge this entire story turns on. I considered, standing there, whether to walk up to a microphone during the reception afterward and simply say it publicly, in front of everyone. I had drafts. I had time-stamped files. I thought, enough to at least raise the question. But I also understood with total clarity exactly how that story would actually play out. A 26-year-old unpublished graduate student accusing a legend with nothing but her own drafts and no contract, no witness, no paper trail beyond an advisor-student relationship built entirely on trust. I understood, standing in that ballroom, that if I made this accusation directly, I would lose, not because I was wrong, because the story the room already believed was simply stronger than any story I could tell it that night. I watched him accept congratulations near the bar for almost an hour, shaking hands, accepting embraces from editors twice his age, and I made myself a promise standing there, unnoticed, at the edge of that crowd. I wasn't going to raise my voice that night. I was going to build something so complete that by the time I finally spoke, the room wouldn't have a choice left in what to believe. Chadwick. So I made a different decision. I decided I wasn't going to sue him. I was going to dismantle him slowly, publicly, using the only weapon I actually had that he couldn't take away from me. My own sentences about someone else's sentences published under a name that wasn't mine. I started writing literary criticism under the name Sparrow 3 months after that ceremony for a small but respected online literary journal that published sharp, anonymous critical voices as a matter of editorial policy. I chose the name deliberately. Sparrows are unremarkable birds, easy to overlook, present in almost every environment without anyone particularly noticing them. Exactly the quality I needed people to associate with the voice before they eventually discovered what it was actually capable of. I spent the first month simply establishing Sparrow's credibility on unrelated books, careful, rigorous reviews of other authors' work, building a reputation for precision long before I ever mentioned Thorne's name. One early Sparrow essay on a debut novelist's overhyped literary thriller actually ended up quoted in the publisher's own marketing material, a detail I found darkly funny at the time. A voice I'd built specifically to eventually destroy a legendary reputation was, in the meantime, apparently helping sell somebody else's book jacket. I let that happen. It was useful cover, and it meant that by the time Sparrow finally turned toward Thorne, the essay didn't read like a grudge. It read like exactly what Sparrow had always done: careful, rigorous attention, applied evenly, regardless of whose reputation happened to be on the receiving end of it. My first essay on the Orchard of Ash wasn't an accusation. It was simply a close reading, meticulous and precise, pointing out that the novel's prose rhythm bore almost no resemblance to Thorne's earlier celebrated work, that the sentence lengths, the specific cadence of his metaphors, the entire structural fingerprint of the book had shifted so dramatically after 12 years of silence that it read, stylistically, like an entirely different writer. Huh. I didn't say stolen. I didn't say plagiarism. I simply said, in careful, devastating prose of my own, something has changed in Malcolm Thorne's hand, and the literary establishment seems strangely uninterested in asking what. An essay found an audience faster than I expected. Sparrow became, within a few months, a voice literary critics actually watched for, precise, unforgiving, never cruel, without evidence to back it up. I spent that period teaching myself computational stylometry, the actual science of analyzing an author's unconscious linguistic fingerprint, sentence length distribution, function word frequency, syntactic patterns too small for a casual reader to notice but measurable, mathematically across a body of work. I taught myself from academic papers, mostly sitting in the university library late into the night the same way I used to sit in that diner writing The Glass Orchard, teaching myself a discipline nobody had assigned me because I finally had a reason worth learning it for. I ran Thorne's two early novels against The Orchard of Ash myself, using open source tools any literature graduate student could access. The statistical divergence wasn't subtle. It was the kind of gap that in any other context would have ended a plagiarism investigation within a week. I didn't publish the raw analysis yet. I was building towards something bigger than one essay. 6 months into writing as Sparrow, I ran into Malcolm Thorne at a departmental function, in person, as Josephine Marlowe, his former student. He'd read Sparrow's essays by then. Everyone in that world had. The function itself was an unremarkable faculty mixer, the kind of event with warm wine and a cheese plate nobody quite finishes, but I remember every detail of that specific conversation with a clarity most of that year has since faded from. He found me near the drink table, the exact spot, I noted later, where I'd once watched him accept congratulations at the bellwether ceremony a year earlier. "Have you seen this Sparrow character's writing?" he asked me, swirling wine in a glass, entirely unaware of the specific arrogance in asking me that question directly. Vicious little thing. No credentials, no name, just theories dressed up as literary analysis. Huh, I've read a few pieces, I told him. The stylometric argument seemed fairly rigorous, actually. Rigor requires a name attached to it, he said. Cowardice hiding behind anonymity isn't criticism. It's just jealousy with better vocabulary. Interesting, I said. I always thought jealousy usually looks more like stealing someone else's sentences and calling them a comeback. I watched something shift in his face, just slightly, the first genuine flicker of uncertainty I'd seen from him since the day he slid my manuscript back across his desk. "Excuse me?" he said. I said it's interesting, I told him, perfectly pleasant. That jealousy metaphor, I'm sure it doesn't apply to anyone in this room specifically. Huh. He didn't have an immediate response to that. I finished my drink, told him it was lovely catching up, and walked away, leaving him standing there running back through every word I'd just said, searching for the exact thing he couldn't quite prove I'd meant. Hopped. He started watching me after that conversation, I think, though he never said so directly. My thesis committee suddenly found new concerns with my progress. A recommendation letter I'd been promised for a fellowship somehow never materialized. Small, deniable frictions, exactly the kind a powerful man applies when he suspects something but can't act on it openly. I remember sitting across from a fellowship committee that spring, listening to them politely explain that my application was missing a required letter from my primary advisor, who had apparently simply run out of time to write it despite 3 separate requests over 2 months. I didn't argue. I'd learned by then exactly how these small denials worked. Never quite substantial enough to challenge directly, always just large enough to make you doubt whether you were imagining the pattern at all. He didn't slow down. If anything, his obvious unease told me I was closer than I'd realized. I spent the following 4 months finishing the stylometric case properly, this time with the help of a data journalist named Priyanka Rao, who specialized in exactly this kind of forensic textual analysis and had no personal stake in Thorne's reputation, one way or the other. I found Priyanka the way I'd found most of my allies that year, carefully, indirectly, through a mutual contact who vouched for her rigor before I ever revealed anything about my own connection to the story. Our first meeting, she made me walk her through every piece of my own analysis twice, questioning each methodological choice the way a hostile expert witness might, before she'd agree to run her own independent version of it. I respected that immensely. I needed someone who'd try to break my case before Thorne's lawyers ever got the chance to. Huh. Priyanka's independent analysis confirmed everything I'd found on my own, then went considerably further. She ran The Orchard of Ash against a wider data set, not just Thorne's two early novels, but 3 years of my own published short fiction under my own byline in small literary magazines, work I'd written well before I ever handed Thorne my manuscript. The stylistic match between my early published stories and The Orchard of Ash was, in her words, about as close as computational analysis gets to a fingerprint. We had a timeline, we had a mathematical case. What we didn't have yet was the one thing that would make it undeniable to a room full of people who'd already given this man a standing ovation. The Literary Academy announced that autumn that Malcolm Thorne would receive its Lifetime Achievement induction, the single highest honor the field bestows, at a televised ceremony 6 weeks later. The induction was, by design, an even larger event than the Bellwether Prize itself, a black-tie gathering broadcast on public television, attended by every major publisher, critic, and literary institution in the country. The kind of ceremony that exists specifically to cement a reputation permanently into the historical record. I remember reading the announcement and feeling something settle in me, cold and clear, a specific calm that comes after 18 months of preparation, finally meeting its moment. Priyanka and I decided that was the moment. Not because it was dramatic, though I won't pretend that wasn't part of it. Because it was the one event guaranteed to gather every major literary journalist, critic, and institution in the same room at the same time, with nowhere convenient to look away. We published Sparrow's final essay 40 minutes before the ceremony began, alongside Priyanka's full stylometric report under her own name, with full methodology attached for anyone who wanted to verify it themselves. I revealed in that same essay that Sparrow had always been Josephine Marlowe, Thorne's own former student, the original author of every sentence Priyanka's data had flagged. The essay didn't reach everyone before the ceremony started, but it reached enough people. I watched on a live stream from Priyanka's apartment as murmurs moved through the audience during the opening remarks, phones lighting up in laps, editors leaning toward each other with expressions I recognized instantly, having felt something similar myself, 18 months earlier in a bookstore aisle. Priyanka and I sat on her couch, a laptop propped against a stack of books. Both of us mostly silent, watching the same specific pattern ripple through that ballroom that I'd watched ripple through Denise's cafe on a different live stream in a different story I'd later hear about, months later, from a stranger at a dinner party who swore it had happened almost exactly the same way. I don't know if that's true or just the specific shape these reckonings tend to take once the truth finally arrives at the one room that can't look away from it. By the time Thorne walked up to accept the award, the room had changed underneath him, and he had no idea yet exactly how much. The Academy's president, a formidable woman named Dr. Constance Weller, stepped to the microphone before Thorne could begin his acceptance speech. I watched her hold up a printed copy of Priyanka's report, her expression unreadable to the cameras, but perfectly clear to anyone who'd seen that specific look before. In 100 other rooms, at 100 other moments, just like this one. Before we continue, she said, the Academy has just received a formal stylometric analysis, published within the hour, comparing Mr. Thorne's award-winning novel against both his own earlier published work and the previously published short fiction of a former graduate student, Josephine Marlowe. I'd like to give Mr. Thorne the opportunity to respond to it directly on this stage before we proceed any further. I watched Malcolm Thorne's face on that live stream, the exact color draining from it that I'd waited 18 months to see. This is absurd, he said, his voice noticeably tighter than the warm, practiced tone he'd used for his opening remarks. Stylometric analysis from an anonymous internet critic is not evidence. It's jealousy dressed up in a methodology. The methodology has a name attached to it now, Dr. Weller said calmly. Priyanka Rao, national correspondent, published peer-reviewed work in computational linguistics. I've spoken with her this afternoon. She's confident enough in these findings to put her own professional name on them, publicly, today. Thorne tried one more line of defense, and I want you to hear it. because it's the exact sentence that ended up sealing his own fate more thoroughly than anything Priyanka or I had published. Even if there were stylistic similarities, he said, Ms. Marlowe was my student. I mentored her. Any resemblance in voice would simply reflect my influence on her early development as a writer, not the reverse. Dr. Weller looked down at the report in her hands for a long moment before answering. Mr. Thorne, she said, the short fiction used for this comparison was published under Ms. Marlowe's own name 3 full years before she ever became your student. I have the publication dates in front of me. Would you like to explain how your influence predates the semester you actually met her? He tried once more, his voice noticeably thinner now. This is a coordinated attack on my reputation by a bitter former student and an activist journalist with an agenda. The agenda, Dr. Weller said, appears to be publication dates, Mr. Thorne. I'm not certain those can be accused of bias. A ripple of quiet, mortified laughter moved through the room, the specific kind that happens when an audience realizes all at once that the person they've gathered to honor no longer has a single credible sentence left to offer them. He didn't have an answer to that. I want to be honest and tell you there is a very specific kind of silence a powerful man makes when he finally understands, in real time, in front of every camera in his industry, that the story he's told himself for over a decade has just run out of road entirely. He stood there at that podium for nearly 15 seconds of dead televised silence before Dr. Weller, with what I can only describe as surgical calm, informed him that the Academy would be rescinding both the induction and the Bellwether Prize itself, effective immediately, pending a full independent review. Here is the twist I didn't see coming. The one I want to tell you about now, because it's the part of this story that actually surprised me, even after 18 months of planning every other detail myself. About an hour after the ceremony ended, Priyanka forwarded me an email. It had arrived at her public contact address that same afternoon, before the ceremony had even started, from a woman named Adelaide Ferris. I want to be honest and tell you my first reaction, reading that name, was simple confusion. I'd spent 18 months assuming I was building this case entirely from scratch. The only person who'd ever noticed this specific pattern in Thorne's work. I had no idea. Opening that email, that I was about to learn exactly how wrong that assumption had been. Adelaide Ferris had been Malcolm Thorne's graduate student 15 years earlier. His first novel after his celebrated early success, the one that had actually launched the 12-year follow period narrative in the first place, had, according to Adelaide, also been substantially built from a manuscript she'd handed him for feedback during her own thesis year. She'd never had proof strong enough to challenge him publicly, not at 24 years old, with no reputation and no data journalist willing to run a forensic analysis that didn't exist as a widely available methodology yet, 15 years ago. She'd simply watched her own stolen sentences win prizes under someone else's name, quietly left the literary world entirely, and built a different career, never quite able to explain to anyone why she'd walked away from writing altogether. She wrote in that email about the specific loneliness of watching an entire industry celebrate a man for something he'd taken from her, with no language yet available to even describe what had happened, let alone prove it. She'd spent 15 years telling herself she must have misremembered her own manuscript, the same way I'd spent one long car ride telling myself I must have misremembered mine, hoping desperately to be wrong. She told Priyanka in that email that she'd been watching Sparrow's essays for months, recognizing something in the specific pattern of the argument that she'd never dared make herself. She'd finally decided, reading the final essay that morning, that if someone else was brave enough to say it first, she was finally ready to confirm it wasn't the only time. I want to tell you what that discovery actually felt like, because I think it matters more than the ceremony itself. For 18 months, I believed I was fighting this entirely alone, the only person who understood exactly what Malcolm Thorne was capable of. I found out in one email that I wasn't his first victim. I was simply the first one with the tools, the timing, and the specific stubbornness required to make the theft undeniable in public. Adelaide's testimony, once it became public in the days following the ceremony, transformed the story from a single disputed accusation into a documented pattern spanning 15 years. The Academy's independent review, completed 3 months later, confirmed both cases and opened a formal inquiry into 2 additional former students whose theses had disappeared from the university archives under circumstances nobody could adequately explain. I sat through parts of that review process myself, providing testimony alongside Adelaide, watching a panel of literary scholars and forensic linguists methodically dismantle 15 years of a reputation built, it turned out, almost entirely on other people's unpublished work. One of the panel members, a retired professor of comparative literature, told me afterward that Thorne's genuine early novels, the two that had launched his career before any of this began, showed a completely different stylistic fingerprint from everything that came after, suggesting the pattern might have started even earlier than either Adelaide or I had personally experienced. I remember sitting next to Adelaide during one particularly difficult session, listening to Thorne's attorney attempt, unsuccessfully, to characterize both of our stylometric evidence as coincidental overlap common among writers trained in the same academic tradition. One of the linguists on the panel, without raising her voice at all, simply read the statistical probability of that particular coincidence aloud, a number so small it produced an actual, audible laugh from two people in the back row. Thorne's attorney didn't raise that particular argument again. Malcolm Thorne resigned his professorship within the month. His publisher dropped him entirely. The Orchard of Ash was pulled from print. The Bellwether Committee formally rescinded the prize and awarded it 6 months later in a much quieter ceremony to The Glass Orchard, published finally under my own name, exactly as I'd written it. I invited Adelaide Ferris to that second ceremony. She sat in the front row next to my mother, both of them crying at almost exactly the same moment during my brief acceptance speech for what I suspect were slightly different reasons. Afterward, she told me she'd started writing again for the first time in 15 years, a novel she said she finally felt safe enough to actually finish. We stayed close since. She reads my drafts now, the actual, real feedback kind, the kind Thorne only ever pretended to give either of us. I read hers in return. There's something quietly healing, I found, in two people who were each convinced, for a long time, that they were the only one who'd ever been hurt this specific way, discovering they'd simply been waiting for the right moment to find each other. I think about that whole 18 months often and what it actually required of me. Not rage, though I certainly had plenty of it in that bookstore aisle, standing there reading my own sentences under someone else's name. What it actually required was patience, precision, and a willingness to build something undeniable instead of simply something true, because I'd learned, the hard way, that true and undeniable are not always the same thing, especially when you're 26 years old accusing a man the whole literary world had already decided to believe. I think, too, about how close I came to speaking up that first night at the Bellwether ceremony, walking toward that microphone before stopping myself. I don't regret waiting. But I understand, more than I did before any of this happened, exactly how much that waiting cost me personally. 18 months of watching a thief accept awards for my own words. 18 months of building a case in silence while everyone around me continued praising him. Justice done properly is rarely fast. I want to be honest about that, rather than pretend the satisfying ending erased the difficulty of everything that came before it. I finished a new novel last year, my second, entirely my own from the first sentence to the last, with nobody's hands on it except mine, and eventually an editor's, in the ordinary, unremarkable way that's supposed to happen. I found myself, more than once during that process, checking my own sentences obsessively against everything I'd ever read of Thorne's, terrified some echo of him had lodged permanently somewhere in my own instincts after 3 years under his supervision. It hadn't. My voice, once I actually let myself trust it again, sounded exactly like it always had, underneath everything he tried to convince me wasn't ready yet. If you've ever had something you made taken from you by someone with more standing in the room than you had, I understand that particular helplessness better than most people ever will. I don't have a universal formula for fighting back. I only know that the version of justice that actually lasts tends to be the version you can prove beyond any reasonable argument, rather than the version that simply feels satisfying to say out loud in the moment. Thank you for listening to my story tonight. If it reminded you of something that was taken from you, credited to someone else, while everyone around you insisted you were imagining it, I'd love to hear about it. That specific loneliness, being certain of something the whole room has already decided isn't true, is one of the hardest things to carry alone, and I hope you find your own Priyanka, your own Adelaide, eventually. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around. There's always another one waiting. Take care of each other out there. Good night, everyone.